Good evening, everyone. Welcome to one of the first lectures, our fellows lectures of the IAS for this term. Those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor Layana Kamukuchi from the Anthropology Department, and I'm one of the co-directors of the IAS for the Faculty of Social Science and Health. And I'm chairing the session, this fantastic, what I'm sure will be a fantastic paper on Does Sex Belong on Social Media? Pleasures, Panics and Platforms by Professor Katrin Tiidenberg from Tallin University. So to introduce Professor Tiidenberg, she's a professor of participatory culture at the Baltic Film, Media Arts and Communication School of Tallinn University, Estonia, and also the author and editor of multiple books on social media, digital cultures and research methods, which I was looking at and thinking, oh, we should include it in our teaching actually, and for PhD students and undergraduates. And so they include Tumblr in 2021, also Sex and Social Media, which came out in 2020, Selfies, Why We Love and Hate Them, and the multiple award-winning Making Sense of the Deified World, a methodological guide, which has also come out, which is in Estonian. And many of these are co-edited and co-authored with other colleagues. She also has written The Metaphors of the Internet, Ways of Being in the Age of Ubiquity, which came out also in 2020. Her academic contribution can be tentatively be divided into three. First, she has an exclusive track record in empirical studies of social media practices and the participatory cultures that emerge from them, relying on nuanced and contextual insights into user practices over time and across platforms. Professor Tiidenberg, has been able to explore the dynamics of meaning-making, identity work, community formation, and belonging. Second, she works on analyzing social media as an ecosystem, a dominant infrastructure. By combining the research on practices with principles of critical platform and algorithmic studies, she explores the social and cultural role of social media platforms, applications and algorithms, cross-platform trends, and makes recommendations for platform governance, which is something, as you know, is very much in the news right now. Third, Professor Tiidenberg is systematically engaged in developing social media research methods and digital research ethics. Beyond the academic community, she frequently engages in public scholarship via media commentary and projects intended to combat misinformation or open the grey box of social media platform economy. Currently, she's working on a project on rethinking sexuality in the Nordics and Baltics, and second, the role of internet in young people's political participation. Her upcoming work focuses on trust and visuality on the one hand, and self-hate and technologies of compassion on the other. At Durham, she'll be working on a fantastic project, which the PIs for which are Dr. Willie Rapper in the School of Education, and Dr. Marianne Hardy in the Department of Management and Marketing, as well as other IAS fellows, which includes Dr. Philippa Collins, Professor Robert Hassan. Many of the fellows are here among the audience. On the project Risks to Youth and Studenthood, Commodification, Temporality, and Digital Identity. So this might be a project which might be of much interest to many of the students and colleagues here. This project problematizes undergraduate student participation in image-rich and real-time digital services on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, with an aim to understand how students construct their identities and belonging in such spaces, as well as the effects their participation may have on their mental health and well-being. A very, very topical project indeed. Her particular contribution relates to her expertise on youth engagement, image-rich media platforms, selfie culture, and the role of visuals in identity construction, as well as her experience with visual narrative analysis. I can say that we are all looking forward to this talk here, which is Does Sex Belong on Social Media? Pleasures, Panics, and Platforms. Professor Katrin Tiidenberg.
Very long. Send shorter bio for next time. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for being here. It's a huge honor and a great pleasure. I've never given a talk in a chapel before, so I'm very excited about that. I'm super excited that so many of you came, and I hope you like it. So let's get to it. So sex and social media are an obvious pair of concepts or things to talk about on the one hand, and a really complicated one on the other hand. So the more people use social media, the more sexes there are going to be on it, because sex is fundamentally social, and social media has become the dominant communication infrastructure and an extremely important arena of sociality. So when we think about it this way, it is unsurprising that social media has become a part of people's sex lives, sexual identities, and the ways we kind of think about sex. And we could say that, you know, platform developers and their investors and regulators and parents and teachers and doctors should just accept it. Do they though? No, they don't. Why don't they? We see that most kind of generic social media platforms, and when I say generic social media platform, I mean things like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, severely limit or suppress sexual expression. So it's quite typical for social media sites to ban nudity, to ban portrayals of sexual activity, and there's also evidence that on some platforms and apps there is kind of under-the-table suppression of sexual identity-related talk, especially when it comes to queer identities or LGBTQ plus content. So online expressions of sexuality are usually described as deviant, as risky. In popular discourse, the emphasis is on harm, while at the same time we have these whole industries that make a lot of money and are kind of expected to make more and more money, that are basically sex tech or hookup apps or sexual well-being technologies. So there is this disconnect in here. And there are very many different ways we can think about the intersection of sex and social media. Early research on sex and the internet, or kind of online sex, focused quite a bit on who does what and where and how often. And I'm not saying that these aren't important questions, but I'm rather saying that I think it's quite helpful to think about sex and social media through what sets it in motion and through what constrains it. And this brings in my 3 Ps for today, which are pleasures, panics, and platforms. I will talk about each of them separately, but in our everyday lives, they're obviously entangled. So platforms echo and amplify and distort cultural norms, and through that create moral panics. But they can also echo existing panics, or kind of amplify existing panics. Those in turn can inform policy change, which then will end up constraining what platforms kind of are allowed to allow or are forced to constrain. There is pleasure in using social media as such, but platforms are also mediums for different kinds of pleasures. So the pleasure we find in sexual interaction, in connection, belonging, but also there can be pleasure in fear and violence and subjugation. When those who are typically subjugated find pleasure, it can trouble the status quo, and that can lead to new moral panics. So something can become pleasurable because there is a panic surrounding it, so we can find pleasure in doing something wrong. And there, of course, is pleasure on pushing back on stigma, building safe spaces, finding communities. So it's a lot. And what I will be talking about will necessarily involve some simplifications. So the talk is based on ethnographic and qualitative work that I have been doing for about 10 years. Starting on Tumblr, moving across other platforms, some of which are kind of generic social media platforms and some of which are specifically sexual platforms. Some of this thinking is in the Sex and Social Media book, which was already mentioned, the co-author of which is Emily Vandernagel from Monash University in Australia. It's also available in audiobook, which was my first. Some of it is in the most recent Tumblr book written with Natalie Hendry and Crystal Abedin, and some of it is from the Rethinking Sexuality project in the Nordic contexts. So let's start with pleasures. Now, what do I say when I mean pleasure? It's one of these concepts that is very broadly used in everyday vernacular conversations, but that researchers are having quite a bit of difficulties with pinning down. Am I spitting in this microphone? I don't know where to hold it. So scholars across disciplines tend to agree that there are different types of pleasure. For example, psychologists will differentiate between sensory pleasures, which relate to touch and smell and taste, and non-sensory pleasures, for example, from achievement or from relaxation or from approval or from esteem or support. Sociologists have differentiated between emotional pleasure, intellectual pleasure, visceral pleasure, social pleasure, and physical pleasure. It's broadly agreed across disciplines that pleasures are cyclical in nature. So there's pleasure in anticipating pleasure, then there's pleasure in actually experiencing the pleasure, and then there's retrospective pleasure of thinking about the pleasure that was just had. It's generally agreed that pleasure is situational, subjective, multidirectional, and multidimensional, which is basically a complicated way of saying that what is pleasurable to me is not pleasurable to you, and what is pleasurable to me in one situation is not necessarily pleasurable to me in another situation. So pleasure is about enjoyment, it's about escape, it's about fantasy, relief, satisfaction, and fun. Those are all good words. But pleasure can coexist and even be found in or amplified by pain or loss or negative affect. It can be enhanced by conflict. And we can also be nudged into finding things pleasurable that we didn't previously find pleasurable by other people, mostly those who have power over us. So we can operationalize pleasure as a response to stimuli. We can think about it as affect, but I suggest that we think about it as experiential sense-making. So building on Carl Weick, we could say that pleasure is an experiential, affective, cognitive process directed at constructing plausible interpretations out of ambiguous cues that are sufficient to sustain action, right? Yes, mostly, kind of? Okay. Now, social media use in itself can be pleasurable. Anyone who has found a community or an affinity space, anyone who has found a funny meme, anyone who has found a piece of perfect fan fiction, anyone whose content has gone viral in a good way can attest to that. And obviously there are sexual pleasures, arousal, stimulation, orgasm, which social media can be a tool to mediate. But what I'm interested in is specifically pleasures that emerge out of sexual social media practices that my own work and the work of my colleagues has elevated as important. And obviously this isn't an exhaustive list, but we can say that people use social media for sexual pleasure, so social media as a tool for getting off or arousal or finding partners or fantasy or experimentation. Pleasure of sexual meaning making, which is about self-awareness and confidence, new information, identity work. Pleasure of sexual agency or a sense of empowerment or a sense of control, where social media is a tool for us to kind of feel seen or resist stereotypes or speak up for others. Sociosexual pleasure, which relates to interaction and communities and a sense of belonging. And then pleasure from kind of sexual entertainment or play, so creativity, alleviation of boredom, fantasy. Lists are boring, so I'll give you a couple of empirical examples. Here is one of my participants talking about their experience of consuming content on sexual social media, just kind of scrolling through their feeds. And she said, "It makes me more aware of the things that push my buttons. It exposes me to new interests. It definitely helps me understand inclinations that I do not share. I follow mostly first-person narrative blogs, so I get to read about the whys and what's behind these interests. It's very educational." Here's another of one of my participants, and she's talking about the pleasures of posting sexy selfies. "I post pictures of myself where I like what I see. And the more pictures I take, the more things I find to like. And now I have pages and pages of evidence that I like my body. I have never in my life spent time trying to genuinely like my body, only time trying to not hate my body. Those are two very different things. And here, just to point out that this isn't an erotic young women's practice as it is often portrayed, is a middle-aged man talking about the same thing. That is my body part, and he's talking about his abs. That is my body part that I will never be happy with, no matter what I do. And so I think that through posting pictures of myself and just kind of laying myself bare, so to speak, I've certainly become more confident in my body and less self-conscious. So in both cases of posting sexualized selfies of oneself, we can say that this is a practice of self-esteem and self-confidence, but in one case it is linked to feedback and validation from others, and in another it is linked to kind of learning to love yourself. And social media is experienced as making both of those possible. Here is another research participant talking about how being able to share nudes with a community instead of sexting them one-on-one to a partner, this kind of social aspect, how that has turned it from a self-presentational practice into a very creative, playful one. So she says, I staged another fantasy. I was a warrior princess kidnapped, stripped naked, and molested by an evil alien king. I think in retrospect, it obviously was inspired by Return of the Jedi. I bought a special laser gun for it in the toy store. So to recap, there are many diverse pleasures to be found on sexual social media. Some of them are more obviously what we would call sexual pleasures. And some are very much what we would call social pleasures, and things pertaining to kind of self-actualization. And others are a particular combination of the two, which arguably social media specifically affords. Now that's really nice, right? Great. Self-esteem, loving your body, awesome. But when we look at media coverage, news media coverage of sex and social media, if we look at what, like parenting associations talk about, then pleasures are nowhere to be seen. Instead, we see risk, disease, exploitation, trafficking, crime, addiction. It's very dark, very scary. Which brings us to panics. So we could dismiss this media coverage and say it's just clickbait, but the underlying anxieties feeding this discourse are important. So media scholars and sociologists have again and again demonstrated that representations have normative, regulative power, which in turn has real material impact on people's lives. So practices, identities, lifestyles are either celebrated or erased or vilified in these discourses. And a version of normal is created, solidified, and then used as a yardstick to measure us all. So how we think of the interconnections between sex and social media, especially if we think that this connection is fraught with risk and danger, impacts on how we conduct our intimate lives, how much responsibility we take, how we treat victims or perpetrators of abuse, how we educate children, how we educate teachers, how policies and laws are made, what goes into user guidelines or terms of service agreements of platforms, what kinds of content their owners and their developers kind of demonstratively police. So ultimately, panics that surround sex and social media have a very direct impact on our well-being and the diversity of our cultures. So Emily and I argue in our book that it makes sense to analyze the kind of risk-focused rhetoric surrounding sex and social media as emerging from a historical set of worries that pertain to sex, a historical set of worries that pertain to public life, and a historical set of worries that pertain to technology, and in particular where these overlap, right? Hence the blogs. So we call it the trifecta of anxieties. You can't see my blogs. Which shapes and constrains how social media is experienced as sexual and how sex is social mediated. So we can think of the three mentioned realms as a kind of Venn diagram, which has, for the purposes of the discussion at hand, three key intersections. So where sex meets public life, where sex meets internet, and where public life meets internet. And we're going to talk about all of this. So the first intersection, where sex meets public life, we can say that in the broadest sense, sexuality is generally organized into these systems of power that reward fairly narrow forms of intimacy and punish everything else. So the norms around who should be having what kinds of sex and who can talk about it are overburdened normatively and nearly always political. Now, this is partially why Michel Foucault, for example, did not want to talk about sexual desire, but said, let's talk about pleasure instead. He said that desire has been used as a tool of calibration in terms of normality, and it has all kinds of medical and political connotations. So desires are deemed normal or abnormal or perverse, and he argued that the term pleasure, in comparison, is kind of almost devoid of meaning. Now, this can be argued against because, terminology aside, the pleasures of the lower classes have historically been seen as a potential threat to social order, and were often classified not as pleasures but as vices, and governed in a variety of ways, culturally through norms and discourses, and legally through regulation and rules. Now, the second intersection is where public life meets the internet. Now, how acceptable sex is on the internet depends on whether we think that the internet is a public place, and whether we think that sex belongs into, or sex is a topic of public discourse. Most social media sites and apps and platforms are built to make it easier for us to talk to a lot of people, right? So they kind of give us voice or amplify our voice. So they can be thought of as a form of public space or public sphere, or it's more accurate to say a set of partially overlapping public spheres. Yet, there's a lot of research that says that there's a lot of people using these kind of public places in ways that they experience as private or semi-private. So they perceive these places to not be public spaces. And even if we did say that the internet is public, then that doesn't only invite the question of how people should behave in public places, it invites the question about whether the internet is or should be a public good. And if it is, then how does that link to the questions of sexual citizenship and sexual rights? And this, of course, invites questions about the impact of platformization and datafication. So what kind of sex is allowed or foregrounded in an ecosystem that is increasingly owned by a very small number of private companies who treat our sociality basically just as a source of data? And finally, where sex overlaps with the internet, we find these presumptions about how the internet is used or should be used or shouldn't be used for sex, and what the role of sex is in the development of the internet. So I'm pretty sure everyone here has heard the statement that porn made the internet, and it is even somewhat backed up by research. So the porn industry and sex workers have kind of driven an impressive amount of technological and business innovation. Yet most of the public discourse on the intersection of sex and the internet is focused on risks, right? So we talk about pedophiles and trafficking and children doing porn. But Emily and I also argue that these intersections have then birthed these kind of more specific moral panics, which very importantly have shaped public responses to sex on social media. So moral panics very broadly can be defined as popular discourse that exaggerates or misdirects public worry over some social values that are seen as threatened or public interests that are seen as in danger. So in a moral panic, typically, some kind of an imagined deviance becomes amplified, or less and more devious seeming practices become conflated. So very typically, an innocuous practice like listening to rock music becomes associated with things like becoming a Satanist or bringing a gun to a school. Moral panics very often focus on youth, on women and minorities, who are simultaneously framed as victims, hapless victims who need to be saved, and perpetrators who, because they have no self-control, so, it's all their fault. Panic dynamics that emerge from the trifecta of anxieties that we have talked about have, over the past 3 decades, led to actual legislational change, right? So it's not just that newspapers talk about it and everybody's kind of worried and forgets about it. It actually drives the laws that govern how the internet has been built. So between 2006 and 2009, both Facebook and MySpace were talked about in media as these kind of pedophile hot zones. And this led to a media frenzy that in turn led to the US House of Representatives passing the DOPA Act, or the Deleting Online Predators Act. Its vague language was broadly criticized, and DOPA never passed the Senate, right? So it never made it into the status of the law. But more recently, in 2018, the SESTA-FOSTA twin bills, which we'll come back to, did pass in the American Senate, and this has been directly linked to media scandals surrounding Craigslist, and in particular sex workers using Craigslist as a kind of ad space. So to recap, sex on social media and sex with social media sits in a kind of historical and normatively overburdened trifecta of anxieties, which leads to specific moral panics that actively shape the social media ecosystem through legislation, but also through what platform developers presume the public to want and accept and to think about. And this has brought us to our final P, which is platforms. Now, the specific social media platforms we use, like TikTok or Instagram or Facebook, definitely shape our sexual lives and cultures, but I think it's more important to think about the dynamics and implications of the broader kind of platform ecosystem. So different platforms, who owns them, what their functionalities are, and what their rules are, because that is entangled. This is also because platforms often mimic each other when it comes to changes in governance, because none of them want to be kind of left behind as the only outlier, right? Because then they have to carry the entire burden of image harms and kind of economic harms. This is why we see that when people spreading misinformation or kind of engaged in hate speech finally are deplatformed, there's this domino effect, right? So somebody throws them out and then everybody else follows. We saw that with Donald Trump, for example, right? When he was banned everywhere. Now, social media ecosystem is currently characterized by a very dangerous concentration of power. First, it can basically be said that the top 10 or even less top 6 of the global platforms that cover all of the global social media users, and some of them have completely outsized impact because of their huge user base, Facebook, who has 2.9 billion users. So they have completely outsized kind of impact and get to decide whether sex is part of social life or not, whether sex is part of culture or not, whether sex is an important aspect of our identities or not. And Facebook, legendarily being quite sex negative, has decided that it's absolutely not. Now, second, this concentration of power is even more pointed at the level of the companies that own these platforms, right? So if we take the top 10, then we're looking at 2 American and 3 Chinese corporations whose interpretation of the law, their imaginaries of what the public wants or accepts, their approaches to solving conflicts of interest between business strategy or governmental censorship and public good disproportionately shape the environment where we can express ourselves and create relationships. And finally, this concentration of power is completely appalling and what we can call the infrastructure layer, right? So this is basically, for example, app stores. So Apple's App Store and Google's Google Play dominate the global north and west, and Apple App Store and Tencent My App dominate the Asian markets. And Apple App Store in particular has been criticized not only for kind of anti-competitive and antitrust practices, but more importantly for their kind of opaque banning and pricing principles. So they price out some apps. They randomly ban apps. Oftentimes their logic is moralizing and explicitly kind of proudly sex negative. Now, why does it matter? because when the social media ecosystem is dominated by a small number of corporations that choose not to allow adult content, people have to work so much harder to find these pockets wherein sexual expression is still permitted, which means that many people who would benefit from open discussions or information or a chance to kind of self-reflect in ways that lead to self-esteem and all the stuff we were talking about never get the chance. So if we move on, there are basically two important layers in how platforms shape and constrain sex. So the first layer is that platforms didn't fall from the heavens and they don't function in a vacuum. So they function within a broader kind of cultural, normative, and legal setting. They are subject to laws and regulations, but their owners and their designers also have ideas about what the public expects and how those norms and even those laws should be interpreted. There's one piece of American legislation in particular that has had an outsized importance over internet governance and how social media has developed. It's called CDA 230, and it's part of a telecommunications decency law from 1996. It's generally, there's a section in it that is called 26 Words That Built the Internet, and it's generally kind of considered the piece of legislation that is the basis of free speech on the internet that has led to kind of all the technological innovation. But by today, we also see that there are problems with it. The kind of toxic cultures that have developed on social media can be linked to the same law. Now, what the law does is it says that intermediaries, i.e. platforms, are not liable for what we, their users, post, right? Now, FOSTA SESTA, the law that I already mentioned, that was passed in 2018, was the first time since 1996 when that safe harbor claim was amended, right? So it's the first time since 1996 where platforms can be held liable, and FOSTA SESTA says that they can be held liable for promoting or facilitating prostitution or knowingly assisting, facilitating, or supporting sex trafficking. Now, nobody likes sex trafficking, obviously, but the problem with the law is that it's very vague. What does promoting prostitution mean? What does knowingly mean? How is it going to be operationalized? Also, sex work has a very different legal status in different countries, whereas platforms are international. So, scholars and activists said before this law was passed that this was going to invite kind of regulatory overreach, and it's going to be harmful to already vulnerable populations, and that's exactly what happened. So lots of different platforms thought that it's much easier to just outright ban sexual expression than to start kind of building these more nuanced ways of differentiating fan art from porn, from facilitating prostitution, from joke, from something that knowingly helps sex trafficking. But beyond the US law, there is also the European Commission, Digital Markets and Services Act. China has a whole host of laws from recent years: cybersecurity law, data security law, personal information protection law. You have your online safety bill. So there is this kind of march towards better regulating the internet, and we need to kind of really keep an eye on what premises and cultural tacit assumptions of what is valuable and what is dangerous are built into those. And then the second layer is that we can think of platforms as structuring, in the sociological sense, our sociality. This means that we need to ask ourselves what behaviors and ways of acting the platforms are built to encourage, right? So what does the design, the features, and the functions invite us to do? What is easy to do and what is difficult to do? Then how are those perceived by users? Because yes, we can be kind of herded and nudged, but we are not sock puppets. There's a lot of us who kind of misuse or use platforms in an off-label ways or refuse to use them. Which is what we usually talk about using the term of affordances in my kind of field. I'm not going to go into it, but if you're interested in it, come and have a talk to me about it because I have lots of feelings and some thoughts. And then of course we also have to ask what rules platforms set. You know, what kinds of behaviors and what kind of content is allowed, and how are those rules actually upheld, right? Because we do know that there's a lot of flex in how what is a rule is being upheld. If you are a Kardashian versus if you are a random person, then you breaking the rules will have two completely different outcomes. So let's talk a little bit more about moderation, which is basically the part of the conversation about rules and how they're upheld. So moderation enforces platform policies regarding what content is permissible. And there's a lot of different elements in this process, including how the policies are worded, the algorithmic and the human labor involved in policing whether the rules are being upheld, etc., etc. Now, one way to kind of make it easier to understand moderation is to ask what is being moderated. So here we can think about moderating users and their practices through things like age gating, for example, right? Nobody under 13 is allowed. Or real name policies. You can only use our site if you are Katrin Tiidenberg and not if you are Moonstone Goddess 442, right? And then of course moderating content, right? Through rules of which content is allowed and which content is forbidden. And which content is neither allowed nor forbidden, but it gets shadow banned or kind of suppressed. And then the second question is how, right? How is it then being moderated? So deciding what is kind of acceptably sexy and what is too sexy is very complex and very nuanced, especially across national borders or cultural contexts. So the moderation process is often really opaque. The scale of kind of generic social media platforms like Facebook, which has 2.9 billion users, but also Twitter and Instagram, makes moderation a huge challenge. We don't have time to go into every aspect of moderation in detail, but some important things that I think make sense to pick out. First is the platform policies and the wording and how they're articulated. So this means terms of service agreements and user or community guidelines. Now, no platform out there allows people to post whatever they want, including whatever sexual content they want. So regardless of platform, illegal content, like child pornography, is forbidden. But some platforms are specifically designed for and marketed for adults interested in particular kinds of sex, like swingers or people who practice BDSM or whatever. So they tend to be more permissive of sexual content than most generic platforms. However, they are still restricted by laws, and because some laws in the US and Canada and some European countries have specific obscenity laws, so then specific kind of fetishes or kinks will still be disallowed on those platforms. And terms of service agreements and community guidelines reveal how platforms position themselves with regard to sexual material. And language is really important here, and that's exactly the language that every one of us ignores, right? That's the wall of text in small print with a little birdie or the tick mark in the bottom where we all go like, yes, and nobody reads. So these are usually written deliberately in a broad and vague language, which allows a broad range of interpretations so that the platforms can choose the meaning that best suits them in a particular situation. So Facebook uses this phrase, women actively engaged in breastfeeding, right? They have had this decade-long fight about nipples. So what does actively engaged in breastfeeding mean? How does one passively engage in breastfeeding? I might ask anyone who has ever tried. But you know, both of these, or Tumblr also had a very unfortunate turn of phrase, female presenting nipple. So the nipple was afforded this agency to present as male or female. So this one's male and this one is female. But both of these policies invite people to scrutinize breasts and nipples as always potentially subversive, always shocking, always inappropriate. Despite their importance, as we already talked about, nobody reads these rules. And oftentimes a boilerplate version is used, right? So new developers who set up new apps or platforms will just take one off the most popular site and reuse it without thinking that with it we are reproducing a particular normative framework. Further, because the kind of forerunners in this industry are American platforms, then those rules were written by American lawyers trained explicitly in First Amendment law that kind of deems free speech as the most important value in the hierarchy of values, right? Over, I don't know, tolerance or dignity or privacy or whatever else. So what we want to do is that we want to ask what meanings and values are assigned to sexual content by platform policies. What are the risks and harms that are imagined? What kind of moderation emerges as logical from these imaginaries? And here a comparison between generic social media platforms and sexual platforms is quite informative. So in the project on the Nordic sexual platforms called Rethinking Sexuality, Jenny Sundén, Susanna Basanen and I interviewed developers of a Swedish BDSM site, a Finnish kind of nudes posting site, and an Estonian site for people for swingers and people who are like non-monogamous. And these are all sexual sites, so sexual images, videos, and verbal exchanges that would be banned on Instagram or TikTok are kind of welcome there and are basis of the sociality there. So we could argue that sex is the social glue on those sites. But that doesn't mean that the platforms are unmoderated, right? It just means that their moderation is based on different principles. So if on many generic social media platforms, sexual automatically implies unsafe or risky or harmful, then on those sites, the notion of safety is uncoupled from the sexual. It also means that they can't just take over the boilerplates of Facebook or Instagram. They have to think about what their rules are. So how do they do that? We found that for the users and developers of the Nordic platforms, safety was connected to consent, to authenticity, and to respect. So if we were to make a list of violations that the content and community moderation is imagined to have to deal with, then it would consist of things like harassing or insulting other users, practice-specific harassment, for example, sending non-consensual dick pics, but also spamming users with kind of generic messages of, hi, you're hot, do you want to go out? Fake accounts in the sense of kind of phishing accounts or dummy accounts. And fake content in terms of posting images of others as if they were of you, right? So stealing other people's images. So basically, what was desirable, what was constructed as desirable on those platforms, what was constructed as good behavior, was linked to kind of using the platform sincerely and representing your own kind of preferences accurately. Now, these local understandings of safety and harm and how those link to sex lead to particular forms of moderation that are quite different from how generic social media does it. So on some of those platforms, they rely on a process of verifying users and sometimes even ask for a verification fee. But the verification process is not based on IDs or real names. It is rather a submission of an image or video where you kind of prove that you are you. Some Reddit communities also do it. The developers argue that verification takes care of the vast majority of their need for content moderation because by pre-moderating users, they will end up with a user base who already knows how to act, to quote them, right? On some platforms, there is verification by others, right? So your friend list kind of has to say, yes, she's who she says she is and she's okay. So it's a kind of more vernacular version of verification. On other platforms, there is a very kind of swift system of reporting abuse and very active self-governance by the community. So the platform is really agile in how it responds to reports to abuse. On some platforms, content is moderated before it's published, right? So you post it, but it isn't published before somebody looks at it. Now, colleagues who work on internet governance have talked about platform governance in various ways. So Robin Kaplan, Nathan Mathias, and Mary Moo have written about artisanal moderation or alternative moderation or community-reliant moderation versus industrial moderation. And we could add a way of thinking to this discussion by situating moderation on the axis of kind of diversity of user interests and their aims of using the platform, and on the axis of whether we want to moderate before or after, right? Preemptively or retroactively. And this would help us think about how we define harm and how we operationalize avoiding harm at the level of platform governance and also platform governance scholarship, arguably. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that all social media platforms need to just allow any sexual content and interaction, but the point is that how content is moderated currently on generic social media platforms shows a complete lack of understanding of the role that sex plays in our social lives and in our identities and in culture, and presumes that all users think that social media is a public place and that sex does not belong in public, but only behind closed doors with pulled curtains and preferably the lights off. Now, this shows willful ignorance towards how people use social media, what their practices are, what their needs and motivations are. But it is also indicative of a stubborn refusal to kind of allow people the control or the choice over what they see. So the presumption here seems to be that users shouldn't be seeing some content, but they cannot be trusted to make that choice. Whereas in reality, we all want that choice because while I personally might welcome not safe for work content on some platforms or when I log in with a particular username, but that doesn't mean that I want them in every content, right? So if I go on Twitter to read news of the war in Ukraine, I don't want surprise sex in between of it. And I would like the choice to do so. And we are often told that technologically it's expensive or undoable, which is not true. It is easily doable. So our social lives and our identities are situational, right? I am currently here situationally performing a smart person and a professor and a social media researcher, which doesn't mean that when I go back to my room and FaceTime my kid, I'm not going to perform something entirely different. It is very easy to build platforms that allow us controls over how we present ourselves situationally and how we consume information situationally, and it's currently chosen not to be done. So it has been argued by Allen, McKee, McNair, and Watson that sexually explicit content should just be appropriately labeled. So members of different groups should be allowed to negotiate sexual materials in appropriate ways. So adequate signposting, clear public statements about the existence and the nature and the variety of sexual communities will help people to engage with content that they're interested in. But this would also help with not pushing sexual expression into the dark, seedy corners that entrench this interpretation that sex is shameful, because that impoverishes the quality of sexual discourses and information and suppresses people's sexual rights. Current trends towards shutting down spaces that have been safe havens for the systematically marginalized communities through demoting and demonetizing and shadow banning and deplatforming groups as diverse as sex workers, sex educators, queer folk, disabled folk, trans folk, fat folk, black folk, activists, and sexual subculture members is quite appalling. And platforms still lack a holistic response to addressing at the same time, while they kind of overreach in regulating sexuality in the name of harm, they lack a response to addressing harassment, image-based sexual abuse, malicious flagging, sexual racism, theft of sexual content, and the unethical scraping of sexual databases. So this claim that this is all done for our safety is disingenuous. Now this is depressing, but not to end on a depressing note, or at least at least a little bit of an action-oriented note. In 2021, a group of us that consisted of academics, activists, and sex workers ran a session on alternative ways of moderating sex on social media at RightsCon, which is this kind of convention on human rights on the internet. That was the 10th time they had done it. And based on those conversations and in consultation with various advocacy organizations, we wrote a manifesto. So it's Manifesto for Sex-Positive Social Media, which is available online. There's or maybe no longer, but there was a petition that one could sign. And generally it outlines the steps towards kind of creating sex-positive social media and how that requires structural, systemic changes to the current assemblage of power, labor, and value. There are 7 calls to action in it, and I invite you to read it and share it. And with this, we are done. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic, and I would love to know more about the manifesto, actually. But over to everyone for questions, comments.
Thanks, Kat. That was really good. I really enjoyed it. I loved what you said about moral panics. We had a brief chat about it the other day, and you really explained it to me. I'm wondering about, it seems to me it's really central to social media and in the form that you're sort of thinking about it. I'm wondering, first of all, if you could characterise, if it's possible to characterise the politics of moral panic. And secondly, is it possible to imagine what social media would be like without moral panics?
That's a great question. So there's a lot of literature on moral panics. It's typically attributed to Stanley Cohen in a book called Folk Devils and Moral Panics, Rockers, Mods, and something else from 1972 or 1974. But then there are different schools that actually deal with the kind of politics of moral panics. So there's the kind of British school of thought. Stuart Hall has done quite a bit of work on it, building on Stanley Cohen, which was more explicitly about politics and kind of power and the function that moral panics have in class kind of relations. And it's tricky, right? Because moral panics also function as kind of pressure valves, right? So sometimes a good juicy moral panic kind of gets it out of everyone's system and then we can move on. Whereas at other times when it does very direct, I mean arguably it always interferes in politics, especially the small p politics of everyday relations and representations, but if it also directly interferes with lawmaking, right, then I think we should be really careful there. And ideally, our political system should be built to stop that, like the example with the DOPA, right? So it passed kind of one level and then was stopped at the other level, right? Because people said this is crap, it's a bad law. And 2018, that didn't happen, right? So we can question whether we're moving towards, with the rise of populism, are we moving towards all of our legislation happening based on moral panics? Which arguably is true. Mm-hmm. And hence, I don't know if we can imagine social media without moral panics, because I don't think we can imagine culture or sociality without moral panics. So they're kind of part and parcel of humans doing things together.
Got it. Thank you.
So another question here. Last question.
So the whole point of that talk kind of seems to me that you were saying that people should have the choice of what to see on social media in terms of sex. But like, I feel like we can see really clearly that people are really bad at choosing what they should be seeing, like in a more sort of less kind of deep way. Like the destigmatization of like kink and the conversation surrounding that has led to vanilla being sort of insult nowadays, and at a sort of more extreme end, porn and looking at sex has been proved to like make men more violent towards women, especially sexually. So there's sort of like a sense like surely social media sites have some duty to people to show them less harmful sex. But then with that, you come back to this problem of how do you choose what's harmful, what's normal, without like, you know, moral panic and social media having all that responsibility. So how do you reconcile those two? What's the right ratio of getting involved?
Right, that's a great question. I don't know is the very honest answer, but we're working on it diligently. Very smart people are thinking about it all the time. So a couple of things. Again, the kind of like porn makes men violent is a statement from only some of the research from about 15 years ago. So porn has changed a lot, right? So the kind of increase in what are we going to call it? It used to be called alternative porn, but now amateur porn, right? So a lot of kind of just people that posting content about themselves has become so mainstream that now porn companies are faking the aesthetic, right? So we'll have non-amateur porn be framed in a way that it would look like amateur porn because this is vastly preferred, right? Amateur porn and a lot of the kind of kink content has also mainstreamed consent negotiations, right? So I'm not saying that what you're pointing to doesn't exist, I'm just saying that it's not at all black and white, right? So it's really messy. And because the whole topic lends itself to moral outrage and lends itself to kind of moral panic coverage, then it's really difficult as a person who doesn't spend all their time researching it to know what kind of is a reasonable sentiment to have about this. So we are very much nudged towards outrage and anxiety, right? And I'm not saying that we have to, that there isn't things to be kind of conscious about or that everything is great. I'm just saying it's not as bad as we're often told. And then when it comes to moderation, I absolutely think that social media platforms should be responsible for not only the content that they allow people to see, but how they build the features and functions, right? So from the Facebook whistleblower scandals, we saw that they knowingly build or refuse to reform functionality that is actively harmful, right? So the angry face reaction button weighs 5 times as much in terms of the algorithmic kind of thinking of whether it's going to circulate this content than a like. This leads to angry making content being circulated 5 times more fast because and it's called sticky, right? So content that is sticky, so affect laden, so that like elicits an emotional response. It might be laughter or joy, or it might be outrage or anger. Keeps us on the platform longer, right? So it's sticky, we stick to it, we stick around. Facebook knew that. They knew that it led to spread of misinformation. They did nothing about it, right? Because there isn't enough oversight. So in Katrin Tiidenberg's universe, right? First of all, Facebook wouldn't have been allowed to buy Instagram, and definitely not WhatsApp. And there should be no platform that has 2.9 billion users. And every platform should be small, and the ecosystem should be fragmented, and we don't need to be all kind of easily reachable to each other. And it's fine for there to be communities and networks that can then self-moderate and self-regulate. So in some cases, we are fine at making choices, and in others we aren't. And in third situations, we are easy to manipulate, right? So in terms of the current kind of social media economy, it's totally broken.
I said last question, but Johannes says
I'm good.
we could have one. That's a fantastic talk. We should have one.
Do you want to?
And maybe you can continue the discussion with her later.
So someone with a slightly conventional definition of sex would probably argue that sex and the internet are mutually exclusive because sex can be virtual, yet the internet is virtual, which doesn't mean, of course, that sex cannot be instrumental. Sorry, that the internet cannot be instrumental to sex. Very different, actually, from pleasure or desire or fetishism or pornography, which are by and large all about virtuality, but always have been. So I do wonder then to what extent the internet, to users that grew up with the internet and have more internet than sex, to what extent that changed their definition and understanding of sex in the first place as something that is virtual even before it is real in their life, becomes real in their lives. Because that seems to be something that previous generations, for the longest time, weren't able to experience.
If only we could blame it all on the millennials. So there is this fascinating study that offers this notion of motivated definitions of sex, which shows that it's really not self-evident what sex is. So they did a huge survey and they asked people, does that count as sex? What, is this sex? Is this sex? What about this? What about this? So there's this really long roster of this goes in there and this doesn't go in there and these things touch and these things don't touch. And what they found was that not only did that vary across people, for the same person, and this is where the motivational definition comes in, it would vary based on, am I talking to my priest, my doctor, my mom, someone I like and want to hook up with, my ex-partner, my friends. So I will say that, this is definitely sex when I'm accusing someone of cheating, and I will say this isn't sex when I'm telling how many people I've had sex with, right? So it is unobvious what is sex, right? And then with the kind of internet or technology, what happens is that, if, I don't know how to be not crass about this and where you are on your acceptance of crassness, if you have an orgasm that was primarily helped by me, right, then we could say that that's sex. And if I managed to do that by showing you pictures of me on the internet or typing out a story about evil alien king and what was it, then, why is that not sex, right? Because if we say, no, it has to be human fleshy bodies touching, then, what about if I give you a toy that is remote controllable and I go into the other room and turn it on? Is that then not sex?
I was asking a question.
I have various other questions which I'll have a chance to discuss later on, but on that excellent note of the virtual and the real, let's go for a vote of thanks, a real vote of thanks from Professor Anne Durham.
I'm just a poor bloody biologist, it's all very simple for us. My name, for those who don't know me, is Anne McLennan. I'm the Master of Haplocology. It's lovely to see such an audience here this evening from all parts of our college community and from around the university. I think a really great demonstration of that relationship between the IAS and colleges and what the best can bring out. I've been here for 5 years and I wasn't in Durham before, and we've had just a fascinating array of people who've come to live amongst us once or twice a year. And I also really appreciate the IAS is currently just looking at how we can best build on that relationship with colleges and make it work even better in the future. Katrin said something at the beginning about the strangeness perhaps of talking in the chapel, and I overheard some of the guests arriving wondering if this really was the appropriate setting. I hope we find our chapel a rather nice round table structure for such talks. And unfortunately our chaplain Julia can't be here tonight, but she would be thoroughly approving of the topic. She really thinks this space should be used for open discussion on topics that interest people and matter to people. And I think hardly have done better than that tonight. She would also be really sorry not to be here because she would have pinched ideas for her next sermon. She specialises in very appealing topical contemporary matters in her sermons. Thank you, Katrin, for a wonderful, wide-ranging lecture, the very best of the specifics of the topic, but in a really broad context, reflecting on many aspects of society, and from our moral panics to the power holders to questions of cultural diversity. We've been through moderators, legal control, definitions, pleasures, obscenities, meanings and values, normative, safety, choice, trust, ethics, harm and panic. I think we've had all life here in this talk. You've clearly already generated much conversation. For those of us lucky to go to dinner with you this evening, I'm sure there'll be much more over that, and I'm sure beyond for the rest of the term in all the different parts of the university which you belong to. Thank you very, very much indeed.